At my daughter's wedding, her groom raised his glass and said, "To the poor, annoying old man who only shows up for the free food." Everyone laughed at me. I stood up, walked to him, and whispered 5 words that made him freeze. Then, as I left the party, he went pale when he realized who I took with me. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. The crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the ballroom as I adjusted my 20-year-old suit jacket for the 3rd time. Everything around me screamed money, from the imported Italian marble floors to the ice sculptures that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Helen's wedding was everything she had dreamed of, and I was genuinely happy for her, even if I felt like a fish out of water among all these people in their designer clothes and expensive jewelry. I stood near the bar, nursing a glass of water, watching my daughter float around in her $8,000 dress. She looked radiant, absolutely beautiful. At 28, Helen had grown into an elegant woman, though sometimes I wondered if I recognized the girl who used to climb trees in our backyard. That girl seemed like a lifetime ago. "Dad, you made it!" Helen appeared beside me, her face glowing with happiness. She kissed my cheek, leaving a faint trace of her expensive perfume. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, sweetheart," I said, straightening her veil slightly. "You look absolutely stunning." She beamed at me, then glanced around the room. "I'm so glad everyone could be here. Brian's family, all our friends from the country club." Her voice trailed off as she looked at my outfit. I caught that familiar flicker of embarrassment in her eyes, the same look she'd been giving me for years. "I should go find Brian," she said quickly. "Mingle, Dad. Enjoy yourself." I watched her walk away, her heels clicking against the marble floor. My chest tightened with that familiar ache, the distance that had grown between us over the years, despite everything I'd done to bridge it. "Sir, would you like something from the bar?" A young waiter appeared beside me, probably wondering why someone in my clearly budget attire was standing in this exclusive venue. "I'm fine, thank you," I replied, forcing a smile. The reception area buzzed with conversation about vacation homes in the Hamptons, luxury cars, and business deals worth millions. I recognized some faces from Helen's social media posts, her new circle of friends from the country club where Brian was a member. These people lived in a world I had once known intimately, but now could only observe from the sidelines. Brian approached the microphone on the small stage, his perfectly styled hair gleaming under the lights. At 32, he was everything Helen thought she wanted. Handsome, successful, connected to all the right people. His family owned a chain of high-end restaurants, and he worked in some financial firm downtown that I never quite understood. "Ladies and gentlemen," Brian's voice echoed through the ballroom as conversations died down, "if I could have your attention for just a moment." I moved closer, setting my glass down on a nearby table. Helen stood beside her new husband, her hand resting on his arm, looking up at him with complete adoration. "Today has been absolutely perfect," Brian continued, his confident smile never wavering. "Surrounded by family and friends who matter most to us, people who have supported us, believed in us, and helped us build the life we want together." The crowd murmured appreciatively. I found myself smiling too, despite the growing knot in my stomach. "Of course," Brian paused, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. "We all have those relatives who show up to these things. You know the ones I'm talking about." A few people chuckled nervously. My smile faltered. "The old, poor, and inconvenient ones who only appear at family events." Brian raised his champagne glass, his grin widening as laughter rippled through the crowd. "But hey, at least they're consistent, right?" The laughter grew louder. I felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me, some amused, others embarrassed for me. Heat crept up my neck as conversation stopped entirely. Even the waiters had paused their service to watch. Helen's face had gone pale, but she didn't say anything. She didn't defend me. She just stood there, frozen, as her new husband publicly humiliated her father at her own wedding. "So, here's to family," Brian continued, completely oblivious to or uncaring about the cruelty of his words. "All kinds of family." The crowd raised their glasses, many still chuckling at his joke. My hands clenched at my sides as I felt 57 years of dignity crumble in that moment. Every sacrifice I had made, every sleepless night I had endured, every dollar I had scraped together to give Helen the life she wanted, none of it mattered. To them, to her new husband, to the people she chose to surround herself with, I was just the embarrassing poor father. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. I straightened my shoulders and began walking toward the stage. The laughter died down as people noticed my movement. Brian's confident expression flickered slightly as I approached him, close enough that only he could hear what I was about to say. I leaned in, my voice calm and steady. "You don't know who I am." Those 5 words hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. Brian's face went from confused to nervous in seconds. His champagne glass trembled slightly in his hand as he tried to maintain his composure in front of the crowd. I didn't wait for his response. I turned on my heel and walked straight toward the exit, my footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet ballroom. But I wasn't leaving empty-handed. My car was parked just outside, a modest sedan that I'd driven for 8 years. But it wasn't the car that mattered. It was what was locked in the glove compartment. A thick manila envelope that contained documents Brian had never seen, papers that would change everything he thought he knew about Helen's poor, inconvenient father. As I reached my car, I could hear the murmur of confused voices drifting from the ballroom behind me. Helen would probably try to call later, to smooth things over, to explain that Brian didn't mean anything by it. But this time, there would be no smoothing over. I sat in my car for a moment, holding the envelope that contained the truth about who I really was. 20 years of living a lie, of letting them think I was nothing, of protecting Helen from a reality she wasn't ready to face. But after tonight, after what Brian had done, the charade was over. Tomorrow, everything would change. I sat in my small apartment that night, staring at the manila envelope spread across my kitchen table. The documents inside told a story that Helen had never heard, a truth I had hidden for 20 years to protect her from the weight of what I had sacrificed. It began when Helen was 16. She had been dating Marcus Wheeler, the son of one of the most prominent families in our city. I was running Hartwell Construction then, a company I had built from nothing into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. We owned properties across 3 states, employed over 200 people, and I was considered one of the most successful contractors in the region. Helen was my pride and joy, brilliant and beautiful, with dreams of attending Columbia University. She had already been accepted early admission when everything fell apart. The night I got the call from the police station, I thought my world had ended. Helen and Marcus had been arrested at a party where drugs were found. Not just any drugs, enough cocaine to suggest distribution, not simple possession. Marcus's father, Senator James Wheeler, made it clear what would happen if the story went public. "Your daughter's future is over," he told me during our meeting at his estate. "Columbia will rescind her acceptance. No decent university will touch her. But Marcus is my son, and I won't let his life be destroyed by some contractor's daughter." I sat across from him in his mahogany-paneled office, watching him shuffle through legal documents with the casual confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for anything. "However," he continued, "I'm prepared to make this all disappear. The charges, the arrest record, everything. Marcus will take full responsibility, but he'll get community service and sealed juvenile records. Your daughter walks away clean." "Children, what's the catch?" I asked, though I already knew there would be one. Senator Wheeler smiled, the kind of cold smile that powerful men wear when they're about to destroy someone weaker. "You disappear your business, transfer your assets, liquidate what you can, and make sure there's no paper trail connecting you to your current wealth. My son will not be associated with the family of some rich contractor who couldn't control his daughter." My hands had clenched into fists under the table. "You want me to give up everything I've built?" "I want you to become nobody," he said simply. "Your daughter made her choice when she decided to associate with my son. Now, you make yours." I had built Hartwell Construction with my bare hands, working 18-hour days, missing birthdays and school plays. Also, Helen could have the life I never had. But faced with watching my daughter's future crumble or sacrificing everything else, the choice was obvious. How long do I have, I asked. 2 weeks? Those 2 weeks were a blur of lawyers, offshore accounts, and hastily arranged property transfers. I moved our assets into a complex web of trusts and shell companies, all designed to make it look like Jacob Hartwell had lost everything in a series of bad investments and market crashes. On paper, I became exactly what Senator Wheeler wanted. Nobody. The properties went into trusts with Helen as the beneficiary, though she didn't know it. The investment accounts were transferred to entities I controlled but couldn't be traced back to me. The business itself was sold to a subsidiary I had created, with managers I trusted running day-to-day operations. Helen never learned the truth about that night. The official story was that Marcus had been dealing drugs, and she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The charges against her were dropped due to lack of evidence, just as Wheeler had promised. Marcus got community service and went on to Harvard as planned, but Helen blamed herself for what happened to our family's finances. She watched me go from successful businessman to struggling handyman, taking odd jobs and living in increasingly smaller apartments. She never knew that I was still receiving income from my hidden assets, that the modest apartment was a choice, not a necessity. She started pulling away from me after that, embarrassed by what she saw as my failure. She threw herself into her studies, graduated valedictorian, and got into Columbia on a partial scholarship that I secretly supplemented through an anonymous donor program. She worked multiple jobs to pay for expenses I could have covered with a single wire transfer, but I couldn't risk exposing the truth. The distance between us grew wider each year. Helen stopped bringing friends around, stopped mentioning me in conversations about her family. She built a new life surrounded by people who had never known wealthy Jacob Hartwell, people who only saw the struggling single father I pretended to be. When she started dating Brian 5 years ago, I recognized the pattern immediately. He was another Marcus Wheeler, privileged, entitled, completely convinced of his own superiority. But Helen was an adult now, making her own choices, and I had learned the hard way that sometimes love means letting people make their own mistakes. Still, I had hoped that maybe Brian would see past the facade, that he would recognize the intelligence and strength that Helen had inherited from me. Instead, he saw exactly what I had trained everyone to see: a poor, inconvenient old man who didn't belong in their world. The irony was devastating. Helen was living in an apartment building I owned, though the ownership was buried under 3 layers of corporate entities. Brian's restaurant had gotten its initial loan from a bank where I was a silent investor. Even the country club where they met was partially financed through one of my development projects. They were living their privileged life, surrounded by my money, supported by my investments in properties I controlled, while treating me like I was some embarrassing charity case. But tonight had changed everything. Brian's public humiliation wasn't just cruel. It was the final proof that Helen had chosen a man who would never respect her family, never honor the sacrifices that had made her life possible. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in months. Robert Chen answered on the second ring. "Jacob, it's been a while." "Hello, Robert. I think it's time we had that conversation about bringing the assets back under my direct control. Are you sure? Once we start the process, there's no going back to anonymity." I looked at the photographs on my kitchen table, pictures of Helen's childhood, back when she used to look at me like I was her hero instead of her burden. "I'm sure. Tomorrow morning, I want you to prepare transfer documents for the Riverside Gardens apartment complex. I'm giving it to Helen as a wedding gift." "The whole complex? Jacob, that's worth $12 million. Cheers. I know exactly what it's worth, Robert. I also want you to prepare documents showing that the Meridian Restaurant Group loan was called in early due to the borrower's failure to meet character clauses in the agreement." There was a pause. "Brian's Family Restaurant Group?" "That's right. And Robert, make sure Helen understands exactly who's been taking care of her all these years." I hung up the phone and gathered the documents back into the envelope. Tomorrow, Brian would learn what happened when you humiliated a man whose power you never bothered to understand. And Helen would finally learn the truth about everything her father had sacrificed to protect her future. The game was over. It was time for Jacob Hartwell to come home. The call came at 7:30 in the morning, 3 days after the wedding. I was having coffee in my small kitchen when my phone buzzed with Robert Chen's number. "Jacob, we have a problem," he said without preamble. "Brian Morrison has been making inquiries about property ownership records. Specifically, he's been asking questions about Riverside Gardens." I set my coffee cup down carefully. "What kind of questions?" "He hired a private investigator to look into the ownership structure of his apartment building. Apparently, his rent check bounced yesterday, and when he called the management company to sort it out, they told him the property had new ownership instructions." A smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. "And what did he discover?" "Nothing yet, but he's getting close. The PI traced the ownership through 2 shell companies before hitting the wall we built around your assets. But Jacob, he's not going to stop digging." I had expected this. Brian was many things, but he wasn't stupid. When a man's entire life suddenly becomes uncertain, he starts asking questions. Let him dig, Robert. In fact, I think it's time we made things a little clearer for him. What do you want me to do? Send him the ownership documents for Riverside Gardens, all of them. Make sure he understands that Jacob Hartwell owns not just his apartment building, but the entire complex. There was a pause. "Jacob, are you sure about this?" Once he knows, Helen will find out. And it's time she learned the truth about who's been taking care of her all these years. I hung up and finished my coffee, imagining Brian's reaction when he realized that the poor, inconvenient old man he had humiliated owned the roof over his head. The call came 2 hours later. "You son of a bitch," Brian's voice was shaking with rage. "You've been lying to everyone this entire time." "Good morning, Brian," I said calmly. "I assume you received the documents?" "Yeah. $12 million, he spat. "You own a $12 million apartment complex and you let everyone think you're some broke handyman?" "I let everyone think exactly what I wanted them to think. The question is, what are you going to do with this information?" "I'm going to tell Helen. I'm going to tell everyone what a manipulative fraud you are." I leaned back in my chair. "Go ahead. Tell her that her father owns the building she's been living in for 3 years. Tell her that the rent she's been paying has been going into a trust fund with her name on it. Tell her that every dollar she thought she earned through hard work was actually subsidized by the man you called poor and inconvenient." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he had hung up. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice much quieter now. "I want you to understand something, Brian. You married my daughter thinking you were getting a woman whose father couldn't offer her anything. You were wrong. Dead wrong. So what? You're rich? Big deal. That doesn't change the fact that you've been lying to Helen for years." "You're right," I said. "I have been lying to her. I've been letting her think she built her life through her own strength and determination, when the truth is, I've been smoothing her path every step of the way. Do you know why I did that? Because you're a control freak? Because 20 years ago, I made a choice to sacrifice everything visible to protect her future. And I wanted her to believe that whatever she achieved, she earned it herself." I could hear Brian breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "Helen lives in apartment 12B, I continued. "The rent is $2,800 a month. She's been paying it faithfully for 3 years, never knowing that every penny goes into an account I set up for her future. The building has 42 units, Brian. Do the math." I heard him curse under his breath as he calculated the numbers. "That's almost $140,000 a year just from Helen's rent alone. The building generates about $1.4 million annually in rental income. Helen has been unknowingly contributing to her own trust fund while thinking she was paying some anonymous landlord." "Jesus Christ, Brian whispered. "But here's what really should concern you," I said, my voice hardening. "You're living in Unit 12A, right next door to my daughter. Your rent is $3,200 a month. And unlike Helen's payments, yours don't go into a trust fund. They go directly into operational costs for properties that support Helen's future." The implication hit him immediately. He had been paying me rent for 2 years, never knowing that the money was helping fund the very lifestyle he thought made him superior to Helen's poor father. "You can't be serious." Completely serious. And Brian, that's just one building. I own 17 properties in this city with a combined value of about $87 million. Helen is the primary beneficiary of the trust that holds them all. I let that sink in for a moment before continuing. Your family's restaurant group, Morrison Dining, took out a loan for $2.8 million last year to expand into the downtown market. Do you know where that loan came from? No, he said, but I could hear the dread in his voice. Meridian Financial, a private lending company that specializes in restaurant investments. I own 60% of Meridian Financial, Brian. Your family's expansion was funded by my money. The phone clattered and I heard Brian cursing loudly. When he picked it back up, his voice was strained. What do you want from me? I want you to understand that your entire life over the past 2 years has been built on foundations I provided. The loan that let your family expand their business, the apartment you live in, even the country club where you met Helen. I'm a silent investor in that club, Brian. 40% ownership through a development partnership I arranged 15 years ago. That's impossible. Robert Chen at Chen & Associates handled all the paperwork. Feel free to verify any of this information. In fact, I encourage you to do exactly that. I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the city where my investments were woven through the infrastructure like invisible threads. But here's what you need to understand more than anything else, I said. Helen doesn't know any of this. She believes she's built her life through hard work and determination. She thinks her father is exactly what you called him, poor, inconvenient, someone who only shows up to family events. Why are you telling me this now? Because you humiliated me in front of 50 people at my daughter's wedding. You made a joke out of the man who has been financing your entire lifestyle without you even knowing it. Brian was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Are you going to destroy us? I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. That depends entirely on what you do next. What do you mean? I mean you have a choice to make, Brian. You can continue being the arrogant, entitled man who thinks he married beneath his station. Or you can figure out how to become the kind of husband my daughter deserves. And if I choose wrong, then you'll discover exactly how quickly a carefully built life can disappear when the foundation is pulled out from under it. I hung up before he could respond, leaving him to contemplate just how precarious his position really was. Helen would learn the truth soon enough, but first, Brian needed to understand that he had been living in a house of cards that I had built, and I could collapse it any time I chose. Helen showed up at my apartment at 9 o'clock that evening, her face flushed with anger and confusion. I had been expecting her since the moment I hung up with Brian, but seeing her standing in my doorway still made my chest tighten. Dad, what the hell is going on? She demanded, pushing past me into the small living room. Brian is acting like a complete lunatic. He's been pacing around our apartment for hours, muttering about property records and bank loans. Yay! I closed the door and turned to face my daughter. She looked exactly like her mother had at that age. The same determined jaw, the same fire in her eyes when she was upset. But there was something else there too, something I hadn't seen in years. Uncertainty. Sit down, Helen. I don't want to sit down. I want to know why my husband is convinced that you've been lying to us about everything. I walked to the kitchen table where I had laid out some of the documents Robert had prepared. Helen followed me, her designer heels clicking against the worn linoleum floor that I could afford to replace, but chose not to. He's not wrong, I said simply. Helen stopped walking. What do you mean he's not wrong? I picked up the deed to Riverside Gardens and handed it to her. She took it with trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the legal language until she found what she was looking for. Jacob Michael Hartwell, she read aloud, her voice getting quieter with each word. Primary owner and beneficiary trust holder. She looked up at me, her face pale. Dad, this is my apartment building. Yes, it is. You own my apartment building? I own your apartment building, Helen. I've owned it for 5 years. She sank into one of my kitchen chairs, still clutching the deed. But that means all this time, when I was paying rent, every penny went into a trust fund with your name on it. You've been unknowingly saving about $34,000 a year while thinking you were paying rent to some property management company. Helen stared at the document in her hands, then looked around my modest apartment with new eyes. The second-hand furniture, the small television, the kitchen appliances that had seen better days. I don't understand. If you own a building worth millions of dollars, why are you living like this? I sat down across from her, choosing my words carefully. Because 20 years ago, I made a choice to protect you from something that would have destroyed your future. And part of that choice meant letting everyone believe that Jacob Hartwell had lost everything. What are you talking about? What happened 20 years ago? I had dreaded this conversation for 2 decades, but now that the moment was here, I felt nothing but relief. The weight of carrying this secret alone had been crushing me slowly, year by year. Do you remember Marcus Wheeler? Helen's face went rigid. What does Marcus have to do with anything? Everything, I said. The night you and Marcus were arrested, his father gave me a choice. Let your life be destroyed by a drug possession charge, or make his son's problem disappear by becoming nobody myself. That's not what happened, Helen said quickly. Marcus was dealing drugs. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The charges against me were dropped because there wasn't enough evidence. The charges against you were dropped because I agreed to Senator Wheeler's terms. I liquidated Hartwell Construction, transferred all my assets into hidden trusts and shell companies, and became the poor, struggling single father that everyone needed me to be. Helen's hands were shaking now. You're lying. I reached for another document, a bank statement showing the current value of the trust funds I had established in her name. The number at the bottom made her gasp. $18.7 million, I said. That's what you're worth right now, Helen. That's what I've been building for you while letting you think I was some kind of failure. She pushed the papers away from her, standing up so quickly that her chair nearly fell over. No, this is insane. You've been lying to me my entire adult life? I've been protecting you. From what? She screamed. From knowing that my father loves me enough to take care of me? From the guilt, I said quietly. From knowing that your teenage mistake cost me everything I had worked for. From carrying the weight of that sacrifice for the rest of your life. Helen started pacing around my small kitchen, her breathing quick and shallow. So when I was working 3 jobs in college, when I was eating ramen noodles for dinner because I couldn't afford groceries, when I was stressed about money constantly, I was making anonymous donations to cover your tuition shortfalls. I was having groceries delivered to your dorm through programs for struggling students. I was watching you struggle and hating every second of it, but knowing that if I helped you directly, you'd figure out the truth. She stopped pacing and turned to face me, tears streaming down her face. Do you have any idea how hard I've worked to build my life? How proud I was that I did it all on my own? You did do it on your own, Helen. The money just made sure you had the opportunity to succeed. Your intelligence, your determination, your strength, none of that came from me. That was all you. But it wasn't real, she whispered. None of it was real. I stood up and walked toward her, but she backed away from me. It was all real, I said firmly. Every achievement, every success, every obstacle you overcame, that was real. I just made sure that one stupid night when you were 16 didn't destroy your chances before you even got started. Helen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you trust me with the truth? Because you were 17 years old and you blamed yourself for everything that happened. You would have spent your entire life trying to pay me back for a sacrifice I made willingly. And now? Now you're 28, married, and building your own life. And your husband just made it very clear what he thinks of the man who made all of this possible. Helen's expression changed suddenly, anger replacing the hurt in her eyes. What does Brian have to do with this? I hesitated, knowing that what I was about to tell her would shatter something else she believed in. Brian has been living in an apartment I own for 2 years. His family's restaurant expansion was funded by a loan from a company I control. Even the country club where you met him. I'm a major investor. That's impossible. Helen, your husband has been insulting and dismissing the man who has been indirectly financing his entire lifestyle. And 3 days ago at your wedding, he did it publicly. She sank back into the chair, her face going white. Oh my God. There's more, I said gently. Brian knew. What do you mean he knew? He's known about our family's financial situation for months. He hired a private investigator to look into property ownership records. He knew I wasn't what I appeared to be, but he still chose to humiliate me at your wedding." Helen's mouth fell open. No, that can't be true." I handed her the final document, the report from the private investigator that Robert had obtained through his own contacts. Helen read it with growing horror, seeing evidence that Brian had been investigating her family's finances since before their engagement. "He knew you had money," she whispered. "He knew, and he married me anyway, and then he treated your father like garbage because he thought it would be entertaining for his friends." Helen buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. When she looked up, her eyes were red but determined. "What are we going to do?" I sat down beside her and took her hand for the first time in years. "We're going to find out exactly what kind of man you married, and then you're going to decide what kind of life you want to build from here. And if I decide I don't want to be married to someone who would do this," I squeezed her hand gently, "then you'll never have to worry about money while you figure out what comes next." For the first time since she was 16, Helen looked at me like I was her father instead of her burden. It was the most beautiful thing I had seen in 20 years. The confrontation with Brian came exactly 1 week after Helen learned the truth. I was sitting in Robert Chen's office reviewing the final documents that would transfer direct control of my assets back to my name when my phone rang. "We need to talk." Brian's voice was strained, desperate. "Now." "I'm in a meeting," I said calmly, watching Robert's eyebrows raise as he continued organizing papers. "You'll have to wait." "Don't play games with me, old man. Helen told me everything. She knows about the money, the properties, all of it." "Good. Then we can finally have an honest conversation. Meet me at Morrison's downtown in 1 hour. Come alone." I almost laughed at his attempt to choose the location, to maintain some illusion of control. "No, Brian, you'll come to my office." "Your office?" "You don't have an office." "Hartwell Development, 42nd floor of the Meridian Building. 1 hour." The silence that followed told me he was finally beginning to understand the scope of what he had stumbled into. Hartwell Development wasn't just a shell company. It was the operational heart of an empire he was only now discovering existed. 42nd floor, he repeated weakly. "Ask for Mr. Chen when you arrive. He'll escort you up." I hung up and turned to Robert, who was shaking his head with something between admiration and concern. "Are you sure you want to do this here?" he asked. "This office represents everything you've built, back from nothing. Bringing him here is symbolic," I finished. "Yes, I know." Robert gestured around the spacious corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. 20 years ago, you walked away from an empire to protect Helen. You built all this back up from scratch, piece by piece, investment by investment. Are you ready for that life to be public again? I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city where my money flowed through dozens of businesses, properties, and investments, like invisible blood through arteries. "I'm tired of hiding, Robert. I'm tired of pretending to be less than I am so other people feel comfortable." "And Helen? Is she ready for this?" "Helen is stronger than I gave her credit for. She's her mother's daughter. She can handle anything." An hour later, Brian sat across from my desk, looking like a man who had just discovered he was standing on quicksand. The confident, smirking restaurant owner from the wedding had been replaced by someone who clearly understood he was in serious trouble. "So this is who you really are," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as he took in the expensive furnishings, the original artwork, the view that only came with occupying the top floors of one of the city's most prestigious buildings. "This is who I've always been, Brian. You just chose to see what you wanted to see." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting around the room like he was looking for hidden cameras or witnesses. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand your situation completely before we discuss what happens next." I slid a folder across the desk to him. He opened it with trembling fingers, and I watched his face go pale as he read the first document. "Morrison Dining Group Loan Recall Notice," he read aloud. "Due to material changes in borrower circumstances and character clause violations, your family borrowed $2.8 million from Meridian Financial," I said conversationally. "The loan agreement includes a character clause that allows for immediate recall if the borrower engages in behavior that reflects poorly on the lender's reputation. You can't be serious. Publicly humiliating your father-in-law at your own wedding certainly qualifies as poor character, don't you think? Brian's hands were shaking as he flipped to the next document. Riverside Gardens lease termination notice. Effective 30 days from date of service. You can't evict us. Helen lives there too. Helen is listed as the primary beneficiary of the trust that owns the building. She can live there as long as she wants. You, however, are just a tenant who violated the terms of his lease agreement. What terms? Disturbing other residents. Harassment of the landlord. Take your pick. Brian set the papers down and stared at me with a mixture of hatred and fear. You're destroying my life. No, Brian, I'm simply removing the supports I unknowingly provided to your life. Everything you're losing was never really yours to begin with. I pulled out another document, this one even thicker than the first folder. Morrison's restaurant group has been struggling financially for the past 18 months. Without the Meridian loan, you've been operating at a loss of about $47,000 per month. How do you know that? Because I know everything about every business that operates with my money. Your family's restaurants are failing, Brian. The only thing keeping them afloat has been the expansion loan you used to open 3 new locations that are hemorrhaging money. Brian slumped back in his chair, the fight going out of him. What do you want me to do? I want you to make a choice. You can continue being the man who thought it was appropriate to mock Helen's father at her wedding, in which case you'll discover exactly how quickly 20 years of business relationships can disappear. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to just above a whisper. Or you can figure out how to become the kind of husband who deserves my daughter. And if I choose the second option, then we renegotiate everything. The loan terms become manageable. Your lease gets renewed. Your restaurants get the kind of financial backing that actually gives them a chance to succeed. Brian was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he looked up, there was something different in his expression. Not respect exactly, but acknowledgement. Why didn't you just destroy me immediately? You could have ruined everything the day after the wedding. Because Helen loves you, I said simply. And despite what you think of me, I want my daughter to be happy. If you can learn to be the man she deserves, then we can find a way to work together. And if I can't, I stood up and walked back to the window, looking out at the city that had watched me fall and rise again. Then you'll learn what it means to cross a man who has spent 20 years building power in the shadows. Brian left my office that day carrying the weight of a choice that would define the rest of his life. But as I watched him disappear into the elevator, I realized that the real choice wasn't his to make. That evening, Helen called me. Dad, Brian told me about your meeting. He's different, scared, I think. How do you feel about that? There was a long pause. I feel like I'm seeing him clearly for the first time, and I don't like what I'm seeing. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, but Dad? Yes? Thank you for protecting me, for sacrificing everything to give me a chance at a real life. I know I didn't understand before, but I understand now. You don't need to thank me, Helen. You're my daughter. Protecting you is what fathers do. Even when it costs them everything? I smiled, looking around my office at everything I had rebuilt from nothing. Especially then. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped under my apartment door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with Brian's handwriting. I choose to try to become the man Helen deserves. What do I need to do? It was a start, but as I would soon discover, some changes come too late to save what's already been broken beyond repair. The divorce papers were filed on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 months after Helen learned the truth about everything. I was having breakfast in my apartment when she called, her voice steady but tired. It's done, Dad. I filed this morning. I set down my coffee cup and closed my eyes, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. How are you feeling? Free, she said without hesitation. For the first time in years, I feel free. The decision hadn't come easily. Brian had tried, genuinely tried, to become the man Helen deserved. He attended counseling sessions, apologized repeatedly for the wedding incident, and even attempted to rebuild his relationship with me. But the damage went deeper than his public humiliation. It was rooted in the fundamental disrespect he had shown not just to me, but to the woman he claimed to love. Helen discovered that Brian had known about my financial situation for months before their wedding. She found emails between him and his friends where he joked about marrying up and mocked her attachment to her loser father. The private investigator's report revealed that Brian had specifically chosen the wedding speech as an opportunity to publicly distance himself from what he saw as the embarrassing side of Helen's family. He never loved me, Helen had told me during one of our long conversations in the weeks following our confrontation. He loved the idea of me, the successful woman with the mysterious trust fund who could elevate his social status, but he was ashamed of where I came from. Now, sitting in my apartment listening to my daughter's voice, I felt the weight of 20 years of careful protection finally lifting from my shoulders. "What's next?" I asked. "Well, I was hoping we could have dinner tonight at your real office. I want to see everything, Dad. I want to understand what you built and how you built it." That evening, Helen stood in the conference room of Hartwell Development, looking through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights below. She had changed out of her work clothes into jeans and a sweater, looking more like the girl who used to help me review blueprints than the polished professional she had become. "This is incredible," she said, turning to examine the architectural models that lined the conference table. "You rebuilt everything." "Not everything," I corrected. "I built something new, something better." Robert had stayed late to walk Helen through the portfolio: 17 residential properties, 8 commercial developments, and a venture capital fund that had invested in 34 successful businesses across the state. The numbers were staggering: a net worth of just over $93 million, all of it built quietly over 20 years, while I pretended to struggle in a tiny apartment. "Why the apartment?" Helen asked, as we sat down for dinner in the executive dining room. "Why live like that when you could afford anything?" I poured wine from a bottle that cost more than most people's monthly rent, thinking about how to explain 2 decades of careful choices. At first, it was necessity. I needed to maintain the illusion that Jacob Hartwell had lost everything, but after a while, it became something else. It became a reminder. Of what? Of what really matters, of who I was before I had money and who I wanted to be after I earned it back. Helen nodded slowly, swirling the wine in her glass. Brian never understood that. He thought money was about impressing people, about proving you were better than everyone else. "Money is a tool," I said. "It can protect the people you love, or it can corrupt everything you touch. The choice is always yours." We talked late into the evening, covering 20 years of missed conversations. Helen told me about the nights she had lain awake in college, worried about tuition payments that I had already arranged to cover. I told her about the investments I had made in her name, the properties I had acquired thinking about her future, the business relationships I had cultivated to ensure she would never lack for opportunities. "I want to work with you," she said suddenly, interrupting a discussion about real estate development in the downtown district. "Helen, you have your own career. You don't need to." "I don't need to, Dad. I want to. I want to learn how to do what you do. I want to understand how to build something that lasts." I studied my daughter's face, seeing her mother's determination mixed with a strength that was entirely her own. "It won't be easy. Building wealth is one thing, but managing it responsibly, using it to create opportunities for others, that's much harder." "Then teach me." 6 months later, Helen had moved into the apartment next to mine, not because she couldn't afford her own place, but because she wanted to understand how I had lived during those years of deliberate simplicity. She spent her days learning the business from Robert and the other managers, absorbing decades of knowledge about property development, investment strategy, and the careful cultivation of business relationships. Brian had left the city entirely, taking a job with his cousin's restaurant group in Denver. The Morrison family restaurants had closed their doors after defaulting on the loan, but I had ensured that the employees were taken care of with severance packages and job placement assistance. Destroying Brian's arrogance didn't require punishing innocent people who depended on the business for their livelihood. Helen threw herself into learning every aspect of the company with the same intensity she had once applied to her college studies. She accompanied me to property inspections, sat in on investment meetings, and gradually began taking on her own projects under Robert's supervision. "You're good at this," I told her one evening, as we reviewed the financial projections for a mixed-use development she had proposed. "Better than I was at your age." "I had a good teacher," she said, not looking up from the spreadsheets. "You never got to be my student before. I always had to protect you from the business, keep you away from anything that might connect you to the wealth." Helen set down her pen and looked at me across the conference table. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "What? Do you regret it? All those years of hiding, of letting everyone think you were something you weren't?" I considered the question carefully, thinking about everything I had gained and lost over the past 2 decades. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that protecting you required me to disappear from your life in so many ways. But I don't regret the choice itself. You got to grow up believing in your own strength, your own capabilities. That foundation will serve you better than any inheritance ever could. And now? Now we build something together. Something that honors both the woman you became on your own and the resources I was able to preserve for your future." Helen smiled, the same radiant expression I remembered from her childhood, before the distance and embarrassment had crept between us. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, sweetheart." 2 years later, Helen stood on the rooftop of our newest development, an affordable housing complex that would provide homes for working families in the downtown area. The project had been her idea, her design, her vision brought to life with the resources I had spent 20 years accumulating. "Your mother would be proud," I told her, as we watched the sun set over the city skyline. "I think about her sometimes," Helen said, "about what she would think of everything that happened." "Oh, she would think we found our way back to each other. That's all she ever wanted." Helen leaned against the railing, looking out over the city where our investments and developments were woven into the fabric of countless lives. "Do you think Brian ever understood what he gave up?" "I think Brian understood exactly what kind of life he was choosing when he decided that humiliating your father was more important than respecting your family." "Good," Helen said firmly, "because I never want to waste time regretting someone who couldn't see what we had." As we stood there together, watching the lights come on across the city, I realized that the greatest wealth I had ever accumulated wasn't measured in dollars or properties or investment returns. It was measured in the relationship I had fought so hard to protect and finally been able to reclaim. Helen was no longer the embarrassed daughter who kept her distance from her supposedly failed father. I was no longer the man hiding in the shadows, sacrificing his identity to protect someone else's future. We were partners now, in business and in life, building something that would outlast both of us. The humiliation at Helen's wedding had ended one chapter of our lives, but standing on that rooftop, planning projects that would shelter families and create opportunities for the next generation, I knew we were writing a much better story together.